This lesson is Trig Day 2, Finding Missing Angles. The goal of this lesson, you will explore the inverse trig functions for sine, cosine, and tangent. You will learn how to use inverse trig functions to find missing angles, and you will solve problems with missing angles and sides. You're going to investigate the inverse trig functions. Sine to the negative 1 is the inverse of the sine function, and it's pronounced inverse sine. Cosine to the negative 1 is inverse cosine, and tangent to the negative 1 is inverse tangent. You can find the inverse trig functions by pressing second and then the function. So second sine will give you the inverse sine, and you would take the inverse sine of a ratio, so say 2 divided by 3, and that's the answer to inverse sine. To find inverse cosine, do second cosine, which is right there, and we'll do 2 divided by 3. You can do any ratio. We're just doing 2 divided by 3. And then inverse tangent is second tangent, so 2 divided by 3. On most calculators, it's second and then the functions to find the inverse trig functions. Now use your calculator to do the investigation. Remember, the second button and then sine inverse is what you would use. And so you would do second sine inverse and then 1/2 to find what sine inverse of 1/2 is. You can do all of these on your calculator, and then the next slide will have the answers. So pause the video right now and then find them. Check your answers with this slide to make sure that you got all of your answers correct. What is going on? What do you notice about your answers in the triangles above? What do you think is going on? Well, we'll talk about it in a second, but the sine inverse of a ratio gives us an angle. The cosine inverse of a ratio gives us an angle. And the tangent inverse of a ratio gives us an angle. These ratios are the same as our SOHCAHTOA. We'll discuss it in the next slide. To find missing angles on a right triangle, you'll use the inverse trig functions. So the sine inverse of the opposite divided by the hypotenuse will give you the angle. The cosine inverse of the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse will give you the angle. The tangent inverse of the opposite divided by the adjacent will give you the angle. SOHCAHTOA is the reverse. SOHCAHTOA tells us that the sine of an angle equals the ratio of the opposite divided by the hypotenuse. The cosine of an angle is the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, and the tangent of the angle equals the opposite divided by the adjacent. To find missing angles, you use the inverse trig functions, and to find missing sides, you use the regular trig functions. Example 1a, find the following angles. So we're looking for this angle. We know that we're given the adjacent side. 43 represents the adjacent side to that angle. And then 59 is the hypotenuse. So we know that the cosine of our angle, it's question mark, equals the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. So 43 divided by 59. This is the actual ratio, but we want the angle. So to find the angle, we use the cosine inverse of the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. So in this particular problem, it's the cosine inverse of 43 divided by 59, which when we use our calculator, cosine inverse of 43 divided by 59, we discover it's 43.2 degrees, and we typically round angles to the nearest degree, so 43 degrees. In this next example, we have the angle is in this position right here, and we have the opposite side to that angle, and we have the adjacent side to that angle. So we know the tangent of question mark is opposite 18 divided by the adjacent, which is 21. Remember our TOA. But once again, we're looking for the angle. So when we look for the angle, we have to use the inverse trig function. So the tangent inverse of 18 divided by 21. So tangent inverse of 18 divided by 21 is 40 6/10, which we would round to 41 degrees. Example 1C. Now this is the angle that we're looking for. Now we have the opposite side to that angle, and we have the hypotenuse to that angle. So since we're looking for the angle, and we know that sine is opposite divided by hypotenuse, we know that the sine of question mark equals opposite, which is 10, divided by hypotenuse, which is 37. This is our sine ratio. But once again, we're looking for the angle, so we need to use the inverse. So the sine inverse, which is what we use when looking for the angle, is 10 divided by 37. When we plug that into our calculator, sine inverse of 10 divided by 37, we get 15 and 68/100ths, which is approximately equal to 16 degrees. Now it's your turn to practice. Find the following angles, the angle for 1, 2, and 3. Pause the video, find the angles, and then the next slide will have all the answers. Now before you proceed to the mixed practice on haiku, I want to show you two problems where the ideas of finding angles and finding sides are mixed together. So this first problem, we're looking for a side. So we're given the angle 52. So we have the opposite to the angle. So our opposite is 33. And x right here, which is what we're looking for, is our adjacent. This would be the hypotenuse. Now we know that the tangent ratio, TOA, we know that the tangent ratio is the opposite divided by the adjacent. So the tangent of 52 degrees equals the opposite, which is 33, divided by the adjacent, which is x. Now to solve this, we're going to put this over 1 and cross multiply. So we have 33 times 1, which is just 33. And we have x times the tangent of 52 degrees. Now remember, the tangent of 52 degrees is a number that your calculator will just find for you. So we need to divide by the tangent of 52 degrees because we are isolating x. So x equals 33 divided by the tangent of 52 degrees, which when we put that into our calculator, 33 divided by tangent of 52, we end up with 25.78, which is 25 8/10. Okay, now this problem right here, we're not looking for a side, we're looking for an angle. Now in reference to this angle, we have the opposite. we also have the hypotenuse. So the ratio that uses opposite and hypotenuse is sine. So the sine of question mark equals opposite, in this case 54, divided by hypotenuse, which is 57. But we're not looking for a side, we're looking for an angle. So when we're looking for angles, we use the sine inverse. So question mark equals the sine inverse of 54 divided by 57. When we do the sine inverse of 54 divided by 57, we get 71 3/10 degrees, which is approximately 71 degrees.